Hello, everybody. Time for another argumentation video. This time looking at the Georges Dreyfus, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping reading. One of the things I'm really interested in is argumentation of other cultures, and I don't assign enough diverse material in the course, so I'm always looking for something that I think will speak to argumentation from a different perspective other than the sort of American cultural perspective. And so for this reading, I like this reading a lot, even though it's about debate. And it's the chapter of his book, The Sound of Two Hands Clapping, about is debate a mode of inquiry? And so when you think about this essay, the first thing that we need to think about is what's the relationship between debate and argumentation. And I don't know if that's really thought about that much by people. What's the relationship between debate and argumentation? How are they different? How are they similar? What differences are productive and useful here? One way to think about the difference between argumentation and debate is argument happens among people informally all the time. It kind of springs up. And arguments can sort of be sent out there without there being another side that will immediately respond. Debates are highly structured and planned events that usually necessitate a judge or someone to come in and say, well, we have these two options. I'm going to go with this one. Debates are often a lot more mutually exclusive than arguments, where people can chime in with a third, fourth, or fifth, or sixth position sometimes. They're quite messy, which is, I think, why people don't like arguments, because they're so messy. But I assign this chapter because I think that the debates, the way that Dreyfus is talking about them, are discussing arguments and what role they have in terms of investigation. We often think of argument, I think in this class we probably have thought of argument, as something one does when one's figured out what's right and you want to convince other people. But what if argument and what if debate, formal and informal modes of disputation, we might say, as a way of distinguishing them? What if that was a way of determining what's real and true and discovering information rather than just transmitting it? What if we had a debate or an argument? It was a way of sort of conducting our own research by virtue of doing an argument. Nobody really thinks of argument or debate these ways, do they? Like, who has a debate to try to discover new information about a topic? I guess maybe some people might go far enough to say, well, if I debate or argue on an issue, I might learn a new perspective or a new take on it. But to discover something new, to do research by arguing? Research seems like a passive thing, unfortunately. It's like something you do independently, alone in a library. You go look things up, you learn it. Or you're in a lab and you conduct experiments. And the experiments don't argue back, usually. I mean, I guess maybe if you're a psychologist, you're doing psychological experiments, people might say, this is stupid, why do I have to do this? But that's not really an argument, is it? But what about the idea of a debate or an argument, the way you think about it? Conducting our way towards new information or new realizations about a thing. Well, that's what this reading is about. Georges Dreyfus is a guy who spent a lot of time in a Tibetan monastery trying to become a monk, studying it, and one of the things they do there is they teach debate as a way of learning how to be a Tibetan monk and how to learn the theology and how to learn Tibetan Buddhism. So I chose this reading primarily because it deals with a religion that's unfamiliar and a part of the world that's unfamiliar, with a kind of people who might be unfamiliar to you, of a very different culture and very different religion. So in a way, I'm trying to make something a little bit more diverse in a field where it's hard to make it diverse. I mean, obviously every culture and every tradition around the world has argumentation, but we tend to focus on the sort of Western, post-Enlightenment, European mode of argumentation. And there's lots of different modes out there from different cultures and different positions, either culture, race, religion, nationality, things like that will lead to different argumentative traditions. But religion is a really good one, I think, to start with. So let's take a look at this essay. And let's see. Oh, look. It's the Kenneth Burke essay I just finished doing. I don't want to do that one. Here we go. Here's the essay. Now, let's see if we can make it to where it fits nicely on the screen. I think that's going to be good. To where you can see it well. Might have to make myself a little bit smaller again in order to Make sure you can read everything. Okay, I don't mind being small as long as you can read the screen pretty well. Okay, so let's jump into this. This is chapter 12, so he's going to refer to earlier chapters, but let's jump into this and sort of talk about it for the next 40 minutes or so. Scholasticism is rarely understood as involving a critical dimension. What does he mean by that? Already, scholasticism, what is that? It's scholasticism is sort of the study of something in order to learn the dictates of it, the absolutes of it, the rules, the way it's thought about, the precepts, the things that are true about it from the experts. So when you enter into law school, for example, you're not there to be critical and discover new things. You're there to learn how the law is done and how it's practiced. And you're there to internalize things that other people long ago discovered to be true. It's not a place where you're going to be creatively expanding your mind or anything like that. That's not what law school is for. Law school is to discipline you into accepting certain truths about the way things are in the law so you can practice law. And that's kind of like what scholasticism is you're entering a monastery to be a part of this religion. And you're not there to question it per se. You're there to learn the precepts and learn the things that are accepted from it. So he's going to look at Tibetan debate, which is what the whole book is about. It's about this practice where they force them to debate as a way of teaching them. They make them debate each other on things that are either true or things that are false based on the sutras, and you have to kind of find different ways of proving your argument in the debates that are judged by the audience. Is it merely an exercise to validate a pre-given truth, or does it represent a genuine avenue of inquiry? I examine the different answers existing within the Geluk tradition, which is the kind of Tibetan Buddhism he's studying at the monastery for. Whereas some view debate as a pedagogical tool, helping students to internalize a party line, others regard it as a practice of inquiry that promotes critical thinking, usually not associated with scholasticism. Like, accept the truth of the religion. This is how it works. These are the things we say to people. This is the belief. You can't vary from that. And so critical thinking, being able to question, oftentimes will eat the source of its eminence. So you teach somebody to critically think, they might question why we need critical thinking at all. Or like in this class, if I teach you to critically think about argumentation, you might wind up saying, well, why do we need argumentation at all? We can do without it. We do not need argumentation. We can do something else like discussion or deliberation. Some of you have made that point in your papers, and I think it's a perfectly fine point. But if I was interested in a scholastic approach to argumentation, I'd say, nope, these are the fallacies. This is what argument is. This is what evidence is. This is how argument is done. Take it. And I'm afraid there are a lot of argumentation teachers out there who approach it this way and not as like sort of questioning the need for argumentation at all, which in our society, there's ample reasons why we wouldn't want to argue because of the extremely poor quality of argumentation from our government to our media, to our daily lives, and even our workplace meetings. So he's going to talk about two teachers to illustrate this. So the importance of the critical element at work in debate is not always obvious. Like any other ludic activity, ludic meaning a game or like a practiced game, it's like a contest game, something play. Like playing a guitar would be like a ludic activity, right? Any kind of thing that requires you to kind of practice it and do it and learn how it works. Debate needs to be learned. Because it takes a long time to internalize the rules and procedures of debate, the learning process at first seems limiting and constraining. The beginner typically feels restricted in his expression because he has difficulty expressing his ideas in the form of consequences or acceptable answers. So that's something specific to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition where one of the arguments is, well, if I accepted that argument, I would also have to accept this argument, and that one is obviously a bad way to live, so we can't accept yours. Or acceptable answers, like when someone asks you a question, is it acceptable to say, I'm not sure, or do you have to give certain answers to certain questions? Are there some questions that are sort of out of bounds or out of line? Sort of like learning how to play chess or learning how to play any game. You have to learn what's an acceptable move or not, and that makes you feel constrained because you're like, I kind of want to play, and all these rules are getting in the way. This experience is reflected in the secondary literature where debate is often depicted as a mechanical exercise without creativity. So now he's going to quote somebody proving that people who have engaged in Tibetan debate see it as uncreative and mechanical. So Stephen Batchelor describes his experience. Reason is subordinate to faith. In other words, you set out to prove what you have already decided to believe. As a Westerner, I assumed wrongly, it turned out, that Tibetans saw logic as I've been taught to see it, as a Socratic inquiry where you subject propositions to ruthless analysis in order to discover whether they're true or false. That's kind of what we think logic is too. But the Tibetan Buddhist approach is to analyze a point of Buddhist doctrine in order to prove that it is true, or analyze a point of non-Buddhism inferior to prove that it is false. So there's a thumb on the scale, so to speak. And I'd say there's one in Socrates too. Socrates is not as open-minded as we are led to believe. He also has an agenda, and his agenda is to say that sophistry is not good, that there are some absolutes, and they can be known if we investigate our souls, like look inside. We can find what is true, or find a form of what is true, and move our way towards that good thing that we can know through. And so instead of it being completely open, I don't think Socrates is completely open either, but you get the point. The point is that you're not really allowed to say anything you want. The goal of that debate is to prove that Buddhism is good. So it's sort of like having a debate topic like, is the United States the best country ever, or the best country to live in right now? Something like it, some loaded debate like that. The view of debate as merely validating a pre-given religious conviction corresponds to the opinion of those members of the tradition who consider debate a useful but limited pedagogical exercise. That means that debate's useful for sort of teaching these truths that are unquestionable, a pre-given condition they have to learn. So debate's useful for a variety of a way to teach something that's true already and doesn't need to be questioned. It also corresponds to the perceptions of the beginner who is learning the debate system. Yet some of the more advanced members of the tradition describe their experience in strikingly different terms. These scholars who have mastered the system speak of an exhilarating sense of openness that debate makes possible for them as they use it as a mode of inquiry in studying the tradition's great text. Who is right? So is it a limited, useful class exercise, which is, I think, the way a lot of American teachers approach it. In your experience as somebody who's been schooled for most of your life, you can imagine a time, or remember back to a time where teachers split the class up into different sides and had a debate in order to kind of teach you something. But the question wasn't real. The answer was sort of predetermined. We were going to get there, and debate was going to show us that we were already right. That's the pedagogical kind of mode. Then there's a mode of like inquiry and trying to do debate to kind of say, what do I not know about this text? How can I figure out what I don't know about this text? How can I study it in rigorous detail? So let's look at questioning in the interpretive process, he says. So following Gadamer, who's a theorist that you probably don't know, you might know, but he's important for hermeneutics, which is the study of meaning. Or how do we know that we've read a text the right way and gotten the right meaning out of it? We noted in Chapter 7 the central role of questioning in the process of understanding a text. Understanding, it was there observed, is not the result of the application of any predetermined procedure, or as Gadamer herself puts it, there's no such thing as a method of learning to ask questions, of learning to see what is questionable. Tibetan scholars have certainly agreed with this statement. There's no rule whose application will lead to a good question. So it's hard to teach people how to ask questions, but it is possible to teach people to locate what is questionable. The Tibetans would agree with that, and they would say, however, that one can be trained to learn how to ask questions in an education that fosters the habit to see what is questionable in the propositions one encounters. So that's what debate provides, is training and trying to find places where you can push on statements and find the place where things can be questioned and challenged. It's almost like farming arguments. Like, how do I know where I can plant or push in a way where something will grow out of it? How do I know where there's good soil for that? I'm kind of feeling it out. Or how do I know a place where I can sort of intervene in that statement? That's a pretty good statement. How can I intervene in that? And that's sort of what the Tibetan debate tradition teaches, according to Dreyfus. When I started to study the great texts, my teachers would often ask me if I had questions. Often did, for these texts were difficult and many points obviously needed clarification. But these immediate questions were not what my teachers had in mind. They wanted to know whether I was able to go beyond what the text was saying, whether I was able to question the concepts within the text rather than accept them as self-evident. At that stage, I had little practice in using debate as a mode of inquiry, and hence I was rarely able to push the inquiry to the level they were seeking. Once my immediate questions were answered, I would be satisfied, feeling everything had been clarified, but this satisfaction was the sign of my lack of understanding. As one of my teachers put it, you do not really understand, for it is only when one has doubts that one understands. Another teacher was even blunter. Only Buddhas and idiots have no questions. Which one are you? I was none too pleased. I thought that my ability to comprehend the text and repeat its points demonstrated my understanding, but I was quite mistaken. So this is an interesting point, because I think a lot of you are kind of scared to talk in the Discord because you're like, my questions are too simple. And it's kind of embarrassing to ask questions about the text in Discord. And I'm kind of disappointed in that, because I hope the Discord would be a more lively place for the discussion of questions about the text, very much like Dreyfus is saying. But in the Tibetan tradition, the questions were questions that weren't about, am I getting this? But more about, how do I process this, or how do I push on this? So you might say, I don't believe it, rather than, what does this mean? And that's what they would want. Now, I think there's a fear among all students of asking too simple of a question. But there really isn't too simple of a question, because one must be able to understand the text before one can doubt it. And you have to be able to understand the text before you can assent to agreeing with it, or saying, yeah, that's a good argument. So I welcome any and all questions in the Discord. I wish you guys would ask more, or at least make some comments about this stuff, because it's pretty deep, and it's easy to get lost in it. I'm not very good at explaining it myself when I'm by myself. It's much better in groups. So we should be chatting in there a lot more, I think, and do it. So to develop that kind of critical thinking, he needs to learn debate. So debate is the one where it teaches you how to doubt in a weird way, rather than just kind of accepting what you're being given in a scholastic sense as true. And then you need to memorize it and process it and internalize it. You need to be able to figure out how to doubt it too, as a deeper expression of faith, or to push that inquiry of determining, now, why is this true? Why is this true in an argument that's satisfying to me, that I can also make satisfying to others who approach me with doubts when I'm proselytizing or teaching the religion to others? But Tibetan debates do more than provide a training in questioning, important as that function is. They also highlight the nature of interpretation and the scope of questioning within Tibetan scholastic traditions. For Gadamer, questioning is first a task of reconstructing the question to which the traditionary text is the answer. But questioning is not merely a reconstructive endeavor that reinforces the authority of the text. So Gadamer is quite aware of the limits of such reconstruction. So you ask a question, and the way that most people answer is they reconstruct. You ask a question about a reading, the teacher will reconstruct the reading in terms that are different, but reinforce that text and provide it to you, so you go, oh, okay, I get it now. But Gadamer is quite aware of the limits of such reconstruction. He argues that as the art of asking questions, dialectic proves it is valuable because only the person who knows how to ask questions is able to persist in his questioning, which also involves being able to preserve his orientation and openness. The art of questioning is the art of questioning even further, i.e. the art of thinking is called dialectic because of the art of conducting a real dialogue. So the more one can question, the more one is unsatisfied with reconstruction, the more one can open one's mind to the possibilities of meaning that might not have been determined yet out of that text. And if you do this in high school or junior high, you get in trouble a lot, right? We don't have time for that. Get back on task. But why? But why? Like, that kind of simple questioning is not what Gadamer means, but being able to push back on a reconstructed answer and go deeper expands the possibilities of the text to mean. So this is the art of thinking. If you think about it, as being able to push on a response with questions is what thinking is. That's the definition of thinking. And that's what Gadamer is offering to us. Gadamer is actually a pretty interesting guy. You should read Truth and Method if you get a chance. A fascinating book that'll make you think very differently about evidence, proof, and discourse. I really like that book. I've read it a couple of times, and it definitely sits with you. So Dreyfus critiques Gadamer and says he fails to clearly distinguish between reconstructive questioning, which constitutes a strategy of retrieval that grants the text authority, and the more radical questioning of the horizon of the text. Like, where does the text extend? How far does it go? What's the disappearing point here? The former hermeneutics, which according to one critic is animated by a faith, a willingness to listen, and is characterized by respect for the symbol as a revelation of the sacred, is important but insufficient. An interpreter who remains bound by the respect for the text can never reach an in-depth understanding. So if you're like, the text is true and right, and I need to figure out why, if you respect that limit, you'll never reach a deeper understanding, because there will be some parts of the text that won't be prodded. If you think about Bible study, sometimes it's like this, where there are certain things that are just off the table for the Bible study, and that actually forecloses deeper understanding of the text, because some things are not permitted because they're inappropriate based on the limits of what the organization, the Bible study members want, and based on the tenets of the faith that they hold. Some things might be considered sacrilegious or foul, blasphemous to bring up or to talk about. This kind of questioning can be at work in Tibetan debates at their best. The students are confronted with other views. Seeing the other students understand the same topics differently, they come to realize the limitations of their own comprehension. So not only are these debates happening, but people are watching these debates. And by watching the debate, you're like, oh, they thought of it that way. I've never thought of it before. And they gain some insight that way. And they also say, wow, that was really good. How can I incorporate that into my understanding without it contradicting how I reach my faith? So that's how it teaches, right? The mere noticing of differences does not foster the critical spirit required for debate. To simply realize that disagreements exist without attempting to resolve them is a form of mental laziness. Let's all agree to disagree. And students fail to push the inquiry to its full extent. They must go further, confronting these different points of view and learning how to undermine each by finding its weak spot. In doing so, they acquire the habit of looking at these other views with suspicion, seeking the proverbial chink in the other's armor, rather than listening to them with respect. So this is the problem with teaching debate this way, is that if they're looking to win and to find doubt, and you only teach doubt, they're always looking for weakness. They're not looking for ways to respect that position. And this is pointed out by writing teacher Peter Elbow in some of his work, where he talks about how we teach students how to doubt the veracity or the truthfulness of writing. Oh, there's a problem here. You didn't cite enough sources. This isn't persuasive enough. Rather than teaching them how to find belief and find the good or find supportable things in student production. So the problem with using debate for teaching is that you create a lot of people who are very cynical and doubt everything. And it's just not enough for them. Rather than creating people saying, wow, I could really learn from listening to the expressions of other people, and not just learn how to take other people down, but learn how to form my own position better and with a more robust kind of structure around it. Yeah. To be sure, such a strategy of suspicion plays only a limited role, for the tradition aims at the closure necessary to create a religiously meaningful universe. So then he's going to go on and talk about medieval debates and the Catholic tradition of debating. And there are some forbidden topics that he brings up, because some of them provided too much freedom and they moved away from scholasticism in terms of medieval debates. So some debates that are not permitted because the debate would require you to take positions that are heretical. That Aristotle was right when he wrote the world is eternal. You'd have to say the world is not eternal to debate that one. Some side would. And that the heavenly spheres stood fire, would not burn flax because God would not exist. Interesting. The teaching of theology is based on fables. Oh yeah, I can see why that one would be banned. So he goes on to the historical causation of this kind of stuff. But he actually argues here that the contemporary university doesn't allow the openness of questions the medieval university did. And that seems counterintuitive. But the reason why is he's saying the business structure of the university and the importance of discipline and hyper-specialization of university professors means that only certain questions are considered valid. If you write and research on questions that are not part of the popularity of the discipline, you're not going to get published, and you're not going to be tenured, and you're not going to be able to teach for the rest of your life and advance people's thought about your discipline. You're not going to be able to do any of that. So they actually had more free inquiry in the medieval university. Let's go back and see what it was. Well, it's about translation and trying to bring things together. But since they were looking at a breadth and diversity of kind of questions to answer, they were actually using debate as inquiry rather than the contemporary university, where you're not using debate that way. It's just kind of a pro forma activity to reinforce the kinds of questions that are appropriate. You might have had frustration of this, trying to write a paper you're really proud of or happy with that addressed something you thought was a cool point in history, and your history professor's like, that's not a question for history. They're trying to discipline you into the questions that are modern and disciplinary instead of pushing a larger form of inquiry. The university just doesn't do that today. So they had to crack down this thing, heterodoxy, right? They wanted orthodoxy. Why? Well, if you want to control the religious message, you want one particular story going out, not a number of different ones that could cause confusion. They had to kind of stamp down on all of it. So there's certain debates that are permitted because they kind of give the illusion that there's some kind of processing going on, but there's definitely a hard limit on there. But the kinds of questions they were dealing with, very real world and very open. Lots of university professors today wouldn't be permitted to go so broad in their own research and work as the medieval scholars were. So in Tibetan Buddhism too, this happens as well. So there are big differences where some are devoted to debate. It's not unified, and he's going to go into some talking about this to say there's a lot of different opinions in Tibetan tradition on debate. So he's going to talk about these guys, Geshe Rabten and Gen Nima. So Geshe Rabten sees debate as a way of teaching the tradition in a creative way, of incorporating the appropriate values and perspective on Tibetan Buddhism into yourself so that you can be a good monk and a good practitioner of the faith. Both of them think debate is pedagogically valuable, but the second one sees it as an inquiry as to why is the tradition that way, and pushing the question, well, why? Why does it have to be this way? Why do we have to practice it this way? Why do we have to interpret the text that way? So these are kind of dangerous questions if you're thinking about it from the point of view of teaching people how to be formal members of a religion. Right? They're the ones who exemplify it. They're the monks. So what possible value would it be to create this kind of orthodox thing by suggesting a heterodox approach or a critical questioning approach? I think it's kind of a cool question. So he's going to look into this. They all agree that debate's the best way to remember a topic because of the stress. Like, think if I made you debate on YouTube or something and I filmed it or did a live stream, you'd be very, very under a lot of pressure and be nervous because, hundreds of people could watch that. I don't really like doing live streams. I like doing this much better because I kind of feel like I'm a little bit more relaxed and sort of in control. If something goes bad, I can stop the video and edit it or start over again like I've done a few times with these. If you're doing the debate, you kind of feel like a lot of pressure to kind of learn and master the different topics, have them committed to your mind. So Geshe Rabten thinks debate is a good mnemonic, which means a good way to remember things. The pressure of the game makes you memorize stuff, and it's a good instrumental way to teach that's more efficient, perhaps, or more fun or efficient or easier for students to recall than other modes of doing it. So he's going to go into these two different approaches. So let's talk about debate as a pedagogical tool. So Geshe Rabten, he talks about the examples here. And he gives some very particular modes of doing it. So Geshe Rabten was a representative of this tradition, viewing debate as useful but limited. It is, as I've emphasized, a kind of game in which answers and questions must be formulated rapidly. Such a procedure is quite different from the in-depth thinking required to develop conviction in the tradition and insight into emptiness. Moreover, debate encourages pride. Students have the impression they know the central readings of the tradition and are thus led on the false sense of mastery. Geshe Rabten often commented on the superficiality of the knowledge one acquires in debate. People think they understand emptiness, but their view has nothing to do with emptiness. It's only directed at words and does not produce the disruption, of ordinary subjectivity required to free the mind. So it's just a tool for the classroom. It doesn't lead to deep levels of mastery and thinking. It can sometimes get in the way, according to this. So it's when you go to the beyond memorization for the purposes of debate that you actually reach the higher levels of insight. Geshe Rabten saw his relationship with students in this way too, is that they had a very one-way relationship, and if you question the teacher, it was disrespectful. He tried to object to him in kind of a debate kind of way that intellectuals might, and he said, am I not your teacher? And he just didn't see there to be any value in that kind of an exchange when he's telling them what the scholastic way is. Now we're going to look at the other. So that's the way of using debate as kind of a tool to make the class more interesting, and also as a useful way to kind of go beyond the slowness of trying to get people to memorize and really take seriously the things they need to learn. But it can become dangerous because it goes over the top. You get a false sense of confidence, which are a lot of my critiques about debate as well in the intercollegiate community. There's a lot of overblown confidence about things people don't understand that debate encourages by limiting the scope of what knowledge about an issue is to the responses that are appropriate for the game. And that's my critique. And it's the same, I guess, here in Tibetan Buddhism. So debate is a mode of inquiry. Some teachers, those who exemplify the followers of reasoning, disagree with Geshe Rabten's views. They consider debate to be a mode of inquiry and investigation whose result is not entirely predetermined. To be sure, unlike modern intellectuals, they do not conceive of the search as being free, at least in principle, to discard any previously held view. So you have to base it on the other views that are present, But you don't know where you're going to go when you start pushing on those views. You might come up with something completely new or different that you never thought of before because of the pressure to kind of come up with the ludic, the gamified kind of arguments. And so it's more of an open thing rather than making the right kind of moves to get back to the appropriate scholastic answer. You're opening up new ways of reasoning and rationalizing and attaching yourself to those ideas that you wouldn't have thought of in any other way. And I like this view of debate, and this is why I like debate for teaching myself, although I don't do it very often. I think that this is much more of my view on this kind of thing. The emphasis on inquiry affects the pedagogical style of these teachers who use debate extensively for their teachings. Classes become less a setting in which final answers are provided than a place to learn how to inquire. Teachers who emphasize this aspect of the tradition often deflect their students' demand for solutions to difficult questions. That's a difficult point and cannot easily be resolved, they are likely to say. Some teachers will refuse to give any positive answer, even if their students have debated a topic for weeks. They see their task as laying out the difficult points without necessarily resolving them. Resolution is left to individual students and must come to their own understanding, often after years of careful reflection and inquiry. I kind of like teaching this way, as you probably have figured out by now. I like laying the things out. What they do is they lay it out and they say, okay, let's debate it. And then the debate goes on and on and on until you've figured out a way to where you're like, I'm comfortable in stepping away from this debate. I feel like I have a pretty good answer that I can defend. So again, Pema Tsen did not mind students' objections, would answer them appropriately. Others would actively delight in objections, so they took as providing an opportunity to get back in the practice of debate, the love of most of those teachers. So a lot of these teachers really enjoy doing debate, and they don't have a chance to do it. And so they like it when their students try to debate them, and they do it in the class. And they have a lot of fun with that, and he tells a story about that. And Gedni Ma was the person who used debates as the center of his teaching practice and it between him and his students. So this is what the author thinks. Dreyfus thinks he's the best model of a good Tibetan teacher, a good teacher who's using debate as inquiry. Though Gedni Ma was exceptional as his sharpness, insight, and learning, he was by no means unique. There are other teachers. And so we're going to get into what he did. So here's his background. And he's very rough and difficult to approach. So he tells a story about this. Let's see if we can find the part where he's talking about how he did it in classes. Okay, here we go. His approach. For him, all this is worth reading, by the way. I'm not skipping it because it's not useful. I'm skipping in the interest of time for the video. So read the whole thing. You'll get a lot of interesting insight into it about how much argumentation happens in religious communities that, from the outsider point of view, look like they're pure and together. For him, the goal of studying great texts was not just to learn a set of well-established positions. Truth cannot be imparted dogmatically, but needs to be appropriated by each person individually. It cannot be captured immediately and certainly not in simple statements, but must be understood through a process of inquiry that involves a certain open-endedness. This critical approach was reflected in Gedni Ma's idiosyncratic pedagogy. I've already mentioned his disdain for monastic manuals. He wouldn't use textbooks. His preference for the great Indian texts of the tradition. He would use these weird old books instead. But Genla was particularly passionate about questioning. Putting little stock in questions related to manuals, he highly valued any inquiry concerning more fundamental texts. But his favorite questions were those, even the seemingly most stupid, as are mine, too. I really love it when students ask stupid questions because those are usually the best ones. They're based on personal reflection. For example, one day a student asked, I understand the impermanence of my body, but what about the large stone in front of this house? Genla was delighted. This is what we call a real doubt, a distinction of the kind of contrived questions raised by clever but superficial students. So instead of asking a question that's sort of constructed to make the teacher think you're really paying attention, he liked the authentic questions, which is like, why would we argue at all, like for this class? Instead of like, what's the difference between the warrant and the blah, 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 or something like that you might make up fake just to kind of impress the professor, rather than a question where it'd be like more, I'm seriously confused kind of question, which are usually the best ones, but those are also the ones that make you feel the most embarrassed, right? So, Genla wouldn't teach. He would mostly just kind of ask questions and then push on people to sort of debate him, which is kind of a weird way of doing it, right? But this is also this is kind of what the kind of teachers want, or the value of argumentation and inquiry is like, I had a pretty good answer to that question, and then I talked to you, and now I've lost my understanding. And so one of the ways of thinking about education is as a means to further the inquiry, which is what Genla is doing here. Is that a way we can use argumentation to learn from? So teaching people how to inquire after ideas, inquire after information, might be what the teaching is. So for example, if you're a physics major, you do have to learn what's come before in physics and where we are and what we know, but you also have to learn how to inquire and inquire after the inquiry, or you won't be a very good physicist. You're not a very good scientist if you're not posing questions. Likewise, if you're an English major and you're studying literature, you have to know what people have said before, but you also have to be able to inquire on that stuff and say, what else could be said? Or what is literature today saying about these kind of themes? And is that really all that can be said about that? And kind of pushing on it and continually asking questions about the nature of the theory and the approach in these fields. Like in my field, people are like, how can we know more about public speaking? And as a professor of public speaking and of rhetoric and argumentation, I say we always have to keep these questions alive because it's more important to ask after them than to feel confident that we figured it out. And our political situation shows us that we're pretty much in new territory here, the way people are dealing with politics these days. And something that a lot of people are writing about and trying to figure out. We're not there yet. Okay, so how can somebody use argumentation and debate as a way of inquiring after something that's supposed to be a fixed point of truth? How does that teach or push the truth or understanding they're supposed to get? How is it supposed to do that? So the way that Dreyfus answers this is he says, it's about faith. So faith and doubt are not opposites, but they have a relationship. The opposite of doubt is belief. Either I have a proposition I'm entertaining or I doubt it, provided I do not reject it entirely. Faith, how is different. Perhaps a convenient way to articulate the relation of these three elements is to say that at its best, faith is the result of the dialectic of belief and doubt. So one of the ways one could think of teaching someone how to have a strong faith in something or strong commitment or belief to something is to keep doubt and belief in a constant dialectical relationship. That is a debate in your head between your belief and your doubt, where one day the doubt is winning and one day the belief is winning. But the important thing is that debate is kept alive. And I think it's kind of a nice model. And I hope that in this class you'll leave with that kind of thing about like, do I understand argument? I think argument is like this. Okay, I think argument's this. Then other days you're like, is that really what a good argument is? And that leads to kind of a faith in pursuing argument. That's kind of like the way I teach, or I hope that you're seeing that. You might not be seeing that quite yet, but that's kind of what I'm aiming at there. Okay, so sometimes people get the wrong understanding through debate, but that's okay, I think, because if you're using argument as inquiry and you get the wrong understanding, you're constantly going to be questioning it, and that position is going to move. So the question is it better to, in a class, get a strong understanding of something, or is it better to get a strong dispute in your head going about something? Which class would you prefer to walk away with? What's true knowledge there for you? And that's what this is. This article's talking about. Let's go to the end. I don't want to go. It's kind of the chapter goes on, and we're kind of at the end of the video here. And I think all this stuff is worth looking at because you can see how debate and argument can be serve as inquiry. But I want to go to the conclusion here and go over a couple of things that he says there. Where is that part? Might have been up a little bit more. So he kind of goes into this teacher's life, but there's one part, I can't find it right now, but one of the things is that Dreyfus gets interested in is how do we know what an intellectual is? And an intellectual would be somebody who seems to know what are the important things to discuss on a particular issue, might be one definition. So if one is constantly pushing after the argumentative points on something, how are you an intellectual if you're doing that? And one of the answers of that is the ability to kind of keep a position until that position is no longer tenable, to defend it not to a point of, I'm so passionate about my beliefs, I'm going to force them on you, but defending it argumentatively to a point where now there's a point where you can't quite find a satisfactory answer might be the model of intellectualism that his debate-oriented teacher held. So, yeah, I think that's all the specifics I really want to get into on that. So, what exactly is the point of this essay? I think we need to think of argumentation very differently than some of the readings have suggested. And we're going to look at more essays in this unit about it. Argumentation has its faults and flaws, like debunking that we saw before, or like the fallacies that we've talked about. And even the conceptualization of fallacies is flawed, as we've talked about. And now we're kind of pushing on it, saying there are other models of debate. So debate as a teaching tool, or argumentation as a teaching tool, or argumentation as a way of inquiring after what is true and right and good. We can engage in argument in order to develop understanding of the right answer, instead of finding the right answer and then arguing with other people, which is the way we think about it. Most people in the country think of argument as something you do after you discover the truth. But as we see from this chapter, Dreyfus encounters this very inspirational teacher who uses argument to teach something that should be scholastic. It should be about principles, and here's what we mean, and here's what the religion says, and you have to know this. But instead of doing that, he wants to teach faith rather than belief, and he pushes on that. So the question is, what does this do for your understanding of argument? How does this influence your definition? And do you want to broaden argument away from its political or legal context into one that encompasses other kinds of relation, such as the quest after meaning or understanding, or what we should be doing, or what's factual and true? It's an interesting way to think about argument. I hope you liked the reading. I hope you liked this discussion of it. And think about how maybe argument could be used in inquiry in different ways based on the model that you get from this chapter. All right, always ask questions. Leave a comment, or you can leave a comment in the Discord and we'll chat there.